When the wagon train disappeared into the storm and left Lydia Hale alone with her infant daughter, she thought death had come for them both. But salvation arrived on horseback, a rugged cowboy who would change everything she thought she knew about survival, trust, and second chances. This is the story of how a broken wheel led to a broken heart, and how the cruelest betrayal opened the door to the truest love. Stay with me until the end, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The sky turned the color of a fresh bruise just before noon. Lydia Hale had been watching the clouds gather since breakfast, her unease growing with each passing hour as the wagon train rolled steadily westward across the Montana Territory. She sat in the back of her covered wagon, nursing 3-month-old Rosie while the wheels creaked and groaned beneath them, protesting every rock and rut in the primitive trail that stretched endlessly toward the distant mountains. "Storm's coming," her husband Thomas had announced that morning, his voice carrying that particular edge of irritation he had developed somewhere around Fort Laramie. A bad one by the look of it. He'd been different since they'd left Missouri 6 weeks ago. Quieter. More distant. His eyes seemed to focus on something beyond the horizon, something Lydia couldn't see and didn't understand. She told herself it was just the stress of the journey, the weight of relocating their small family to a new territory where Thomas had promised they'd start fresh, build something meaningful. He'd been so convincing back in Independence, painting pictures of vast rangeland and opportunity, of a future bright enough to blind. Now, watching him pace beside their wagon with that haunted look in his eyes, Lydia wondered what shadows he was running from. "Thomas," she called, adjusting Rosie against her shoulder. "Should we tell the wagon master? Maybe we should make camp early, wait out the weather." He glanced at her, and for just a moment she saw something flicker across his face. Fear? Guilt? It vanished before she could name it. "No need," he said curtly. "We'll make it through, and these prairie storms blow over quick." But this storm didn't blow over quick. By mid-afternoon, the wind had risen to a howl that made the canvas cover snap and billow like a living thing trying to tear free. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes. Lightning began to dance along the western horizon, brilliant white forks that split the darkening sky. Wagon Master Samuel Brennan rode down the line, his weathered face grim beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "Tighten your covers," he shouted over the wind. "Secure anything that might blow loose. We're going to push through to Willow Creek. There's shelter there." Willow Creek was still 8 miles ahead. Thomas had disappeared an hour earlier, claiming he'd spotted elk tracks leading away from the trail. "Fresh meat would be welcome," he'd said, loading his rifle. "I'll be back before dark." Lydia had wanted to protest, wanted to beg him to stay, but the words had stuck in her throat. There was something in his manner that morning, something final and resolved, that made her afraid to speak. So she'd simply watched him ride away on their one good horse, leading their only pack mule, his figure growing smaller and smaller until the grass swallowed him whole. That was the last time she saw her husband. The storm hit with the force of divine wrath. Rain came in sheets so thick Lydia could barely see 3 feet beyond her wagon. The wind screamed like a living creature, tearing at the canvas, rocking the wagon on its axles. Thunder crashed so close and so loud that baby Rosie woke screaming, her tiny face red with terror. "It's all right, sweet girl," Lydia whispered, clutching her daughter close, trying to keep her voice steady, even as her own heart hammered against her ribs. "Mama's here. Mama's got you." The wagon lurched. For one terrible moment, Lydia thought they were tipping over. She braced herself against the wooden side, protecting Rosie with her body, praying prayers she'd learned as a child in her mother's parlor back in St. Louis, back when life was measured in tea parties and piano lessons, and the worst thing that could happen was rain on a Sunday picnic. The wagon settled again with a groan, but the motion had changed. They were listing to one side now, dragging. "Mrs. Hale!" a man's voice shouted from outside, barely audible over the storm. "Mrs. Hale, you've got a broken wheel!" Lydia pushed aside the canvas flap and peered out into the maelstrom. Jacob Morrison, one of the younger men traveling with his parents in the wagon ahead, stood in the rain looking like a drowned rat, his hat long gone, his coat plastered to his thin frame. "What?" she shouted back. "Broken wheel!" He pointed down at the rear axle. "The iron rim split. The wooden spokes are cracking." Fear turned Lydia's blood to ice water. A broken wheel on the prairie, in the middle of a storm, with no husband to fix it. This was the nightmare every pioneer woman feared. "I'll get help," Jacob called. "We'll fix it." But even as he said it, even as he turned to run toward the front of the train, Lydia could see the wagon ahead of them pulling away, disappearing into the curtain of rain. The gap widened, 20 yards, 30, 50. By the time Jacob returned with wagon master Brennan and 2 other men, the rest of the train was a quarter-mile ahead and moving steadily through the storm. Brennan examined the wheel with the quick efficiency of a man who'd seen every kind of disaster the trail could offer. His face, when he looked up at Lydia, told her everything she needed to know. "Can you fix it?" she asked anyway, because hope dies hard even when common sense knows better. "Not in this weather," Brennan said. He had to shout to be heard. "Maybe if we had time, if we could get the wagon jacked up proper, replace the whole wheel assembly. But we don't have time, Mrs. Hale. This storm's only going to get worse, and if we don't make Willow Creek before nightfall, we'll lose stock. Maybe people." "Then wait," Lydia heard herself say. "Wait until the storm passes. Just a few hours." "Can't." Brennan's voice was flat, final. "Already lost time stopping. Any longer and we risk the whole train." The whole train. 43 wagons, 217 people. Women, children, families seeking new lives in the Montana Territory, all depending on Brennan to get them through safely. And here stood Lydia Hale, one woman with 1 baby and 1 broken wagon, asking him to risk them all. She saw the calculation in his eyes, saw the moment he made his choice. "Your husband," Brennan said. "When will he be back?" "I don't know." The truth tasted like ash in her mouth. "He went hunting, he said before dark." Brennan glanced at the sky, which was already dark as twilight, though it couldn't be past 4 o'clock. "We can't wait that long. I'll leave you supplies, food, water, blankets. You've got your wagon for shelter. When your husband returns, the 2 of you can make repairs and catch up. We'll leave markers every mile so you can follow the trail. Willow Creek first, then Fort Benton. You'll find us." "But," Lydia started. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hale." And he was. She could see it in his weathered face, hear it in his rough voice. "It's you and your baby, or everyone else. You know I can't risk the train for 1 family." He left her a sack of cornmeal, some salt pork, 2 canteens of water, and an extra blanket. Then Samuel Brennan touched the brim of his hat, turned his horse, and rode away into the storm without looking back. The other men followed. Young Jacob Morrison lingered longest, his face stricken. "Mrs. Hale, I'm so sorry. If it was up to me—" "Go," Lydia said quietly. "Your family needs you." Within 10 minutes, the last wagon had vanished into the rain. Lydia stood in the storm, holding her baby, watching the space where the wagon train had been, feeling the weight of abandonment settle over her like a burial shroud. Around her, the prairie stretched empty in every direction, thousands of acres of grass and sky, and nothing human except herself and Rosie and the broken wagon tilting drunkenly on its crippled axle. The storm intensified. Lydia climbed back into the wagon and tried to make sense of what had just happened. Thomas was gone. The wagon train was gone. They were alone in the middle of the Montana Territory, with a broken wheel, limited supplies, and a storm that showed no signs of stopping. She changed Rosie's wet clothes with shaking hands, wrapped her in the extra blanket Brennan had left, and held her close while the wind tried to tear their canvas shelter apart. "It's all right," she whispered into her daughter's soft hair. "Daddy will come back. He'll fix the wheel. We'll catch up to the train. Everything will be all right." But Rosie cried like she didn't believe it. The afternoon bled into evening. The rain never stopped. Lightning continued to crack across the sky, each flash illuminating the wagon's interior in stark white detail. The bags of cornmeal getting damp from leaks in the canvas, the barrel of water Thomas had insisted they bring, the small trunk containing Lydia's wedding dress and her mother's silver brush, and all the other precious things she'd carried from her old life into this new one. Looking at that trunk now, Lydia felt the first hot sting of tears. What had she been thinking? That she could just pack up her entire existence, load it into a wagon, and roll away into the wilderness like some kind of adventurer from a dime novel? She was a city girl, born and raised in St. Louis with servants and gas lamps and streets that had actual names. She knew how to host a tea party and play Beethoven on the piano. She could embroider a perfect rose and write thank you notes in flawless copperplate script. She didn't know the first damn thing about surviving on the prairie. "Thomas, where are you?" she whispered into the darkness. The storm answered with another crack of thunder. Rosie nursed fitfully, then fell into an exhausted sleep against Lydia's chest. Lydia held her and listened to the rain hammer against canvas and tried not to think about all the ways they could die out here. Exposure, starvation, wolves, Indians, outlaws. The list was long and getting longer. Around midnight, the wind finally began to ease. The rain continued but softer now, a steady drumming rather than a deluge. Lydia allowed herself to hope that maybe the worst had passed. That's when she heard the horse. At first she thought she'd imagined it, hoofbeats in the rain, coming closer. Her heart leaped. Thomas. He'd come back. Everything would be all right after all. She scrambled to the back of the wagon, pushed aside the canvas flap, and peered out into the darkness. A figure on horseback emerged from the rain like something out of a fever dream. Lightning flashed, and for one brilliant instant Lydia saw him clearly. A tall man on a tall horse, both of them soaked through. The man's hat pulled low against the rain, but not low enough to hide the strong line of his jaws, or the way his eyes swept across the scene with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to trouble. This wasn't Thomas. Fear paralyzed her for a moment. Out here, alone, a strange man could mean anything, could mean everything. She thought of the rifle Thomas had taken with him, thought of the small pistol buried somewhere in the bottom of the trunk, and knew with sick certainty that she'd never reach it in time if this stranger meant harm. The man reined his horse to a stop beside the crippled wagon. His gaze took in the broken wheel, the tilt of the wagon box, the mud churned up by the departed train. When he finally looked at Lydia, his eyes were the color of storm clouds, gray and searching. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. "You can't stay here." Lydia found her voice. "I don't have a choice. My wheel is broken. My husband—" "I saw the wagon train pass through my land 4 hours ago," the man interrupted. "Counted every wagon, didn't see this one, which means either you weren't with them or they left you behind." The blunt truth of it hit Lydia like a slap. Left behind, abandoned, cast off like broken freight. "The storm," she tried to explain. "The storm's going to get worse before it gets better," he said, his horse sidling restlessly beneath him. "This is just the eye passing over. The back half will hit within the hour, and when it does, this wagon's going to be thigh-deep in mud. You'll both die before morning." "Both?" He'd said both. Ed. His eyes flicked to the bundle in Lydia's arms, to Rosie's small face just visible beneath the blanket, and something in his expression softened. "You've got a baby." It wasn't a question. "My daughter," Lydia said, pulling Rosie closer. "She's 3 months old. Her name is Rosie." The man nodded once, as if some decision had been made. "My ranch is 5 miles south. I've got a house, a warm fire, hot food. You and your baby can shelter there until the storm passes and your husband returns." "I don't even know your name," Lydia said, hating how her voice shook. "Jonas Reeves. I run the Double R Ranch, about 5 miles south of here." He gestured vaguely in the direction he'd come from. "Been ranching this territory since '71. I'm not going to hurt you, ma'am. I'm trying to help you." Lydia looked at Jonas Reeves, really looked at him. He was somewhere in his early 30s, she guessed, with the kind of weathered face that came from years of hard work under hard sun. His hands on the reins were scarred and calloused. His coat had seen better days. Everything about him spoke of rough living and rougher country, but his eyes, when they met hers, were steady and clear. "My husband," Lydia started again. "If he comes back and finds you gone, he'll see the tracks," Jonas said patiently. "He'll follow them to my ranch, but ma'am, I need you to decide now. That back wall of the storm is coming, and I don't want to be caught in it." Lydia looked at Rosie sleeping against her chest. Her daughter's face was pale, her breathing shallow. The wagon was already cold and getting colder. They had some supplies, but not enough. Not for days of waiting, not if Thomas didn't come back soon, not if Thomas didn't come back at all. The thought crept in like poison, but once it arrived, Lydia couldn't shake it loose. Thomas had been acting strange for weeks. He'd taken their only horse and mule. He'd left to go hunting in the face of an obvious storm. And now he'd been gone for hours, with no sign of return. What if he wasn't planning to come back? "All right," Lydia heard herself say. "All right, we'll come with you." Jonas dismounted in one smooth motion. "Can you ride?" "Not well," Lydia admitted. "I've mostly traveled by wagon or carriage." "That's all right. You'll ride with me. Can you gather what you need?" "Just essentials. We'll come back for the rest once the weather clears." Lydia worked quickly, her hands clumsy with fear and cold. She grabbed the bag of cornmeal, the canteens, 2 blankets, and her mother's silver brush from the trunk. Something precious, something to hold on to. She tied everything into a bundle with shaking fingers while Jonas secured it to his saddle. "Ready?" he asked. Lydia looked one last time at the wagon that had been her home for 6 weeks, at the broken wheel that had sealed her fate, at the empty prairie where her husband had vanished. Then she looked at her daughter, and the decision became simple. "Ready?" she said. Jonas helped her onto his horse with surprising gentleness, making sure she was settled securely before swinging up behind her. His arms came around both sides to grip the reins, effectively caging her and Rosie in a circle of warmth and safety. "Hold on," he said quietly, and then they were moving. The ride through the storm was something out of a nightmare. Jonas had been right. The back half of the storm front hit within minutes, bringing wind that screamed and rain that fell so hard it felt like being pelted with pebbles. Lydia couldn't see 5 feet in any direction. She had no idea how Jonas knew where he was going, but he seemed to navigate by instinct, guiding his horse through the darkness with quiet confidence. Rosie woke and cried, her wails lost in the wind. Lydia tried to shelter her with her body, tried to keep the rain off her face, but it was impossible. They were all soaked through within minutes. "Almost there," Jonas shouted over the storm. "Just another mile." That mile was the longest of Lydia's life. But then, like a miracle, lights appeared through the rain, warm, golden lights that spoke of shelter and safety and survival. The Double R ranch house materialized out of the darkness, a solid structure of timber and stone that looked like it had been built to withstand anything the Montana Territory could throw at it. Outbuildings clustered around it, a barn, stables, a bunkhouse. Fences marked corrals where livestock huddled against the weather. Jonas rode straight to the main house and dismounted, reaching up to help Lydia down. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet hit the ground. She'd been tensed against the horse's movement for so long that her muscles had locked up. "I've got you," Jonas said, steadying her with one hand while grabbing their bundled supplies with the other. "Come on." The front door burst open before they reached it, spilling light and warmth into the rainy night. A woman stood silhouetted in the doorway, older, sturdy, with iron-gray hair and an apron tied around her substantial middle. "Jonas Reeves, what in heaven's name?" she started, then saw Lydia and the baby. Her expression transformed instantly from irritation to concern. "Oh, Lord, get them inside, quickly now." They stumbled through the doorway into a world of warmth that felt almost overwhelming after hours in the cold and rain. Lydia stood dripping on polished wooden floors, clutching Rosie, barely able to process what was happening. The woman took charge immediately. "I'm Martha Quinn," she said, already untying Lydia's wet cloak. "I keep house for Mr. Reeves and the ranch hands. You're frozen half to death, both of you. Come with me." "Martha, they need—" Jonas started. "I know what they need," Martha interrupted firmly. "Hot water, dry clothes, warm food, and a bed. You see to your horse. I'll see to your guests." Jonas met Lydia's eyes for just a moment, and she saw something there. Reassurance, maybe, or a promise that she was safe now. Then he nodded and disappeared back into the storm. Martha whisked Lydia deeper into the house, into a kitchen that smelled of bread and coffee and wood smoke. A fire roared in a massive stone hearth. Quilts were draped over chairs near the warmth. A kettle hung over the flames, already steaming. "Sit," Martha commanded, pointing to a chair near the fire. "Let me see that baby." Lydia sank into the chair, her whole body shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off. Martha gently took Rosie from her arms and began unwrapping the wet blanket with practiced efficiency. "She's cold, but she'll be fine," Martha pronounced after a quick examination. "Healthy lungs from the sound of her crying. How old?" 3 months, Lydia managed. "And you? When did you last eat?" Lydia tried to remember. Breakfast before the storm, cornmeal mush and weak tea. This morning, Martha made a disapproving sound and immediately began moving around the kitchen, assembling food with the kind of speed that came from decades of feeding hungry people. Within minutes, she'd pressed a cup of hot coffee into Lydia's trembling hands and placed a bowl of hearty stew in front of her. "Eat," Martha ordered. "All of it. Then we'll get you both into dry clothes." Lydia ate. The stew was rich and savory, thick with vegetables and chunks of tender beef, and with each bite she felt a little more human, a little less like something the storm had tried to destroy. Martha wrapped Rosie in a warm, dry blanket and held her expertly, rocking and humming while Lydia ate. When Lydia finally set down her spoon, Martha handed the baby back. "Now then," Martha said, pulling up a chair across from Lydia, "tell me what happened. How did Jonas find you?" So Lydia told her about the wagon train, the broken wheel, being left behind, Thomas disappearing to hunt and never returning. She tried to keep her voice steady, tried to present the facts without emotion, but by the end, tears were streaming down her face. "They just left us," she whispered. "My husband was gone, and they just left us." Martha's weathered face was kind but unsurprised. "The trail is hard, child. Sometimes people make hard choices. Doesn't mean those choices are right, just means they're made." "I don't know what I would have done if Jonas hadn't come along," Lydia said. "We would have died out there." "But you didn't die," Martha said firmly. "Jonas found you, brought you here, and now you're safe. That's what matters." The back door opened, letting in a gust of wind and rain before slamming shut again. Jonas entered the kitchen, his hair plastered to his head, his clothes soaked through. "Horses stabled," he reported to Martha. "Storm's still getting worse. We're not going anywhere tonight." Martha stood and immediately began fussing over him the same way she'd fussed over Lydia. "You're soaked to the bone. Go change before you catch your death. I'll heat more water for washing." Jonas's eyes found Lydia across the kitchen. "You all right, ma'am?" Lydia nodded, not trusting her voice. She'd been holding herself together through sheer will, but something about his simple question, his obvious concern, threatened to break her completely. "Thank you," she managed. "You saved our lives." Jonas looked uncomfortable with the gratitude, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Anyone would have done the same. "No," Lydia said quietly. "They wouldn't have. The wagon master didn't. The whole train didn't. You did." A long moment passed between them, something unspoken but understood. Then Jonas nodded once and retreated down a hallway, leaving wet boot prints on the polished floor. Martha watched him go with an expression Lydia couldn't quite read. "That man has a good heart," she said softly. "Too good sometimes. Takes in strays, horses, cattle, people. Can't stand to see anything suffer." "He doesn't seem like the type who'd want to be called good-hearted," Lydia observed. Martha laughed. "No, he surely doesn't. Likes to act tough as old leather, but underneath he's softer than he pretends." She showed Lydia to a small bedroom off the kitchen, simply furnished but clean and warm. "You and the baby can sleep here tonight," Martha said. "There's a cradle in the corner. We keep it for when Jonas's sister visits with her children. I'll bring you some dry night clothes and more blankets." Lydia laid Rosie in the cradle, watching her daughter's eyes drift closed almost immediately. The baby had cried herself into exhaustion during the storm. Now, warm and dry and safe, she fell into the deep sleep of the very young. Martha returned with the nightgown and robe, both well worn but clean. "These were Jonas's mother's," she explained. "She passed 5 years ago, about your size, I think." "I couldn't," Lydia started. "Nonsense, she'd want them used. Nothing sadder than good clothes sitting in a trunk doing nobody any good." Martha set the garments on the bed and turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Your husband, do you think he'll come back?" The question hung in the air between them. "I don't know," Lydia admitted. It was the first time she'd spoken the fear aloud. "He's been different lately, distant, and taking the horse and mule, leaving before a storm. I don't know what to think anymore." Martha's expression was sympathetic but knowing, as if she'd seen this story play out before. "Get some rest, child. Tomorrow we'll see what's what. Jonas and his men can ride out, look for your husband, Maybe fetch your wagon if the wheel can be fixed. But tonight, you sleep. That baby needs her mother strong." After Martha left, Lydia changed into the nightgown and crawled into the bed. It was the first real bed she'd slept in since independence. Not a pallet in a wagon, not bedrolls on the ground, but an actual bed with a real mattress and clean sheets that smelled of lavender. She should have fallen asleep immediately. God knew she was exhausted enough. But instead, she lay in the darkness listening to the storm rage outside and thought about Thomas. Where was he right now? Was he sheltering somewhere, waiting out the weather? Was he hurt? Was he ever planning to come back at all? The questions circled in her mind like vultures. Somewhere in the house she could hear low voices, Jonas and Martha talking in the kitchen. She couldn't make out the words, but the cadence was soothing. Two people who knew each other well, comfortable in their routine. Lydia thought about Jonas Reeves riding out into that storm to bring them to safety. He could have stayed in his warm house, could have told himself it wasn't his problem, could have done what the wagon master did and calculated that 2 lives weren't worth the risk, but he hadn't. He'd ridden out into hell itself to save a stranger and her baby. "Who are you, Jonas Reeves?" Lydia whispered into the darkness. The storm answered with another roll of thunder, but offered no other reply. Finally, exhaustion won. Lydia's eyes drifted closed, and she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep while the wind howled and the rain fell, and somewhere out in the Montana darkness, her husband remained missing, and her old life continued to slip further and further away. She didn't know it yet, but she would never see Thomas Hale again. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first piece of good luck she'd had in a very long time. Lydia woke to golden sunlight streaming through the window and the disorienting sensation of not knowing where she was. For one confused moment, she thought she was back in her childhood bedroom in St. Louis, that everything, the wagon train, the storm, the abandonment, had been nothing but a fever dream. Then Rosie whimpered from the cradle, and reality came flooding back. She sat up quickly, her body protesting with a dozen new aches from yesterday's ordeal. The room was warm, almost cozy, with morning light making patterns on the simple wooden floor. Through the window, she could see endless blue sky, as if the storm had never happened at all. The smell of coffee and bacon drifted under the door, along with the low rumble of male voices. Lydia dressed quickly in her own clothes, still slightly damp but wearable, and lifted Rosie from the cradle. Her daughter blinked up at her with those serious blue eyes, and Lydia felt her heart squeeze with a mixture of love and fear so intense it was almost painful. "We're safe now," she whispered, kissing Rosie's forehead. "Whatever happens next, we're safe." The kitchen was full of men when Lydia emerged. 6 ranch hands sat around a long wooden table, shoveling down breakfast with the focused intensity of people who knew hard work awaited them. They fell silent when Lydia appeared, hats coming off, faces turning curious and respectful. Jonas stood near the stove talking to Martha, but he looked up immediately when Lydia entered. In the morning light, she could see him more clearly than she had in last night's chaos. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. His face had strong, almost severe lines, but his eyes, those storm-gray eyes, held a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rough exterior. "Morning, ma'am," he said, his voice still carrying that rough quality she remembered from the night before. "Hope you slept well." "Better than I have in weeks," Lydia admitted. "Thank you again for—" "Coffee?" Martha interrupted smoothly, pressing a cup into Lydia's free hand. "And you sit right here. I'll fix you a proper breakfast." One of the ranch hands, a young man with red hair and freckles, jumped up to offer Lydia his chair. "Please, ma'am, I was just finishing anyway." Lydia sat, feeling awkward and exposed under so many eyes. These men were all staring at her with a mixture of curiosity and sympathy that made her want to disappear. Jonas seemed to sense her discomfort. "All right, boys, you've seen the lady. Now get on with your breakfast before it gets cold." The men returned to their food, though Lydia could feel them sneaking glances at her and Rosie. She tried to focus on her coffee, on the warmth of the cup in her hands, on anything but the weight of their attention. Martha set a plate in front of her piled high with eggs, bacon, biscuits, and fried potatoes. "Eat," she commanded. "You're thin as a rail. When's the last time you had a decent meal?" Lydia couldn't remember. Life on the wagon train had been a blur of cornmeal mush, salt pork, and whatever game the men managed to shoot. Fresh eggs and real bacon seemed like impossible luxury. Jonas waited until his men had finished eating and filed out to begin their day's work before he pulled up a chair across from Lydia. Martha busied herself at the stove, but Lydia could tell she was listening. "I'm riding out this morning with 4 of my men," Jonas said without preamble. "We'll search for your husband, see if we can find any trace of him. Storm would have washed out most tracks, but maybe we'll get lucky." Lydia set down her fork, appetite suddenly gone. "Do you think, is there a chance he's still alive?" Jonas's expression was carefully neutral. "Can't say, ma'am. Montana Territory is big country, and a storm like yesterday's could have scattered a man in any direction, but if he's out there, we'll find him." "What if he's not out there?" The question escaped before Lydia could stop it. What if he left on purpose?" Something flickered across Jonas's face. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. He'd probably thought the same thing himself. "Let's not borrow trouble," he said gently. "We'll search, see what we find. In the meantime, Martha will look after you and the baby. You're welcome to stay here as long as you need." "I can't impose on your hospitality indefinitely," Lydia protested. Martha snorted from the stove. "Nonsense. This house is too big and too empty. Having a baby around will do us good." Jonas stood, settling his hat on his head. "We'll be back by nightfall. Martha knows how to reach the neighbors if there's any trouble, but there shouldn't be. You're safe here, Mrs. Hale." Lydia looked up at him, this stranger who'd saved her life, who was now riding out to search for a husband who might not want to be found. "Why are you doing this? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Jonas was quiet for a long moment, his hand resting on the back of the chair. "My sister got caught in a blizzard 6 years back," he said finally. "She was traveling from Helena with her husband and their baby girl. Their wagon broke down, and they got stranded. A trapper found them 3 days later, brought them to his cabin, kept them alive until the weather cleared." He met Lydia's eyes. That trapper didn't know them either. Didn't owe them anything. But he did the right thing anyway. Sometimes that's all that matters. Before Lydia could respond, Jonas was gone, the back door closing behind him with a soft click. Martha came to sit across from her, wiping her hands on her apron. "That story about his sister is true," she said quietly. "Caroline and her family. They were half frozen when that trapper found them. Another day and they'd all have been dead." She paused, studying Lydia with shrewd eyes. Jonas doesn't talk about it much, but it changed him, made him more aware, I suppose, of how thin the line is between living and dying out here. Lydia looked down at Rosie, who'd fallen asleep against her shoulder. "I feel so foolish, coming out here, thinking it would be an adventure, thinking Thomas and I would build some kind of new life together." She laughed bitterly. "I didn't understand anything." "Most people don't," Martha said matter-of-factly. "They read those pamphlets about free land and opportunity, and they think the West is some kind of promised land. They don't understand that it's hard and dangerous, and that it breaks as many people as it makes." "Were you born here?" Lydia asked. "Ohio, originally. Came out with my husband in '65, right after the war ended. We homesteaded near Fort Benton, tried to make a go of it." Martha's face softened with old grief. "Henry died in '69. Fever took him. I was going to go back east, but Jonas's mother, Elizabeth was her name, she found me in town, half-starved and desperate, and offered me work. Been here ever since." "You stayed even after she died?" Martha smiled. "This is my home now. Jonas is like the son I never had, and these cowboys are like a dozen more sons, eating me out of house and home." She reached across the table to pat Lydia's hand. "What I'm saying is, family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's just the people who show up when you need them most." The words settled into Lydia's chest, warm and unexpected. She'd lost so much. Her husband, her wagon train, her entire plan for the future. But sitting in this warm kitchen with Martha's kind face across from her and Rosie sleeping peacefully in her arms, she felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. She felt safe. The day passed slowly. Martha set Lydia to work helping with bread, claiming she needed the extra hands, though Lydia suspected it was more about giving her something to do than any real need for assistance. They worked in comfortable silence, punctuated by occasional conversation, and Lydia found herself relaxing into the rhythm of domestic work in a way she hadn't since leaving St. Louis. Around mid-morning, a woman arrived on horseback, younger than Martha, maybe 40, with sun-streaked brown hair and laugh lines around her eyes. She dismounted with easy grace and tied her horse to the porch rail before walking in without knocking. "Martha, I brought those—" She stopped short when she saw Lydia. "Oh, I didn't know Jonas had company." "This is Mrs. Hale," Martha introduced. "Lydia, this is Sarah Brennan. She and her husband Tom run the neighboring ranch." Lydia's heart stuttered. "Brennan? Like Samuel Brennan, the wagon master?" Sarah's eyebrows rose. "Samuel's my brother-in-law. You were with his train." "Until yesterday," Lydia said quietly, "until they left me behind." Understanding dawned on Sarah's face, followed quickly by sympathy. "The woman with the broken wheel. Samuel told us about you when they came through last night. He felt terrible about having to leave you." "Terrible enough to come back?" Lydia couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. "The train was already behind schedule," Sarah said, her tone apologetic but firm. "Any more delays and they'd have risked getting caught in the mountain passes before winter. Samuel made a hard choice, but it was the right one for 200 people. Even if it was the wrong one for me and my baby." Sarah had no answer for that. Instead, she turned to Martha. "I brought the eggs you asked for. Tom butchered a pig yesterday, so I've got bacon and ham too, more than we can use before it spoils." The conversation moved on to practical matters: food, supplies, ranch business. But Lydia caught Sarah glancing at her several times, curiosity and concern mingling in her expression. Finally, after Martha had stepped outside to check on something, Sarah came to sit beside Lydia. "I know you're angry about being left behind," she said quietly. "You have every right to be. But I want you to know that Samuel really did feel awful about it. He barely slept last night." "His guilt doesn't change what happened," Lydia said. "No, it doesn't." Sarah paused. "Jonas is searching for your husband?" Lydia nodded, not trusting her voice. "Jonas is a good man," Sarah said. "One of the best. If your husband can be found, Jonas will find him." She hesitated. "And if he can't be found, well, you're in good hands here. Martha and Jonas will take care of you." I'm not a charity case," Lydia said sharply. "No one said you were." Sarah's voice was gentle, but matter-of-fact. "Out here, we take care of each other. It's how we survive. Today Jonas helps you. Tomorrow you might help someone else. That's just how it works." After Sarah left, Lydia spent the afternoon caring for Rosie and trying not to watch the horizon for Jonas's return. Martha kept her busy with small tasks, mending a torn shirt, peeling potatoes for dinner, churning butter. The work was mindless but soothing, and Lydia found herself grateful for the distraction. The sun was low in the sky when she finally heard the sound of horses approaching. Lydia's heart jumped into her throat. She set down the dish towel she'd been using and moved to the window, Martha coming to stand beside her. 6 riders came into view, Jonas in the lead. Even from a distance, Lydia could read the answer in the slump of their shoulders, the slow pace of their horses. They hadn't found Thomas. Jonas dismounted and spoke briefly to his men before heading toward the house. His face, when he entered the kitchen, was grim. "We searched everywhere within a 10-mile radius of where I found you," he said without preamble. "Covered the area your husband would have been hunting, checked every gully and creek bed. Nothing, no tracks, no signs, no body." Lydia had been preparing herself for this news all day, but hearing it still felt like a blow. "Nothing at all?" "We found your wagon," Jonas continued. "The broken wheel is fixable, but it'll take some work. We'll bring it back here in the next few days, get it repaired properly." He paused. "Mrs. Hale, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Lydia's stomach tightened. "What?" "Was your husband in any kind of trouble? Did he owe money, have enemies, anything that might make him want to disappear?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Lydia wanted to defend Thomas, wanted to insist that he would never abandon his family, but the words stuck in her throat because deep down, she wasn't sure anymore. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "He was acting strange for weeks before we left Missouri. Secretive. He'd receive letters and burn them without showing me. He'd disappear for hours with no explanation. She looked at Jonas helplessly. I thought once we got west, once we started fresh, it would be better. But it only got worse. Jonas and Martha exchanged a glance that Lydia couldn't interpret. Did he take anything valuable with him? Jonas asked. Money? Jewelry? Anything worth selling? Lydia thought about it. He took our horse and mule, and... She stopped, realization dawning cold and sick in her stomach. And the money. We had $300 saved for buying land in Montana. Thomas kept it in a leather pouch. It's not in the wagon. I checked when we were packing to come here. I assumed he had it with him for safekeeping. $300 is enough to start over somewhere, Jonas said quietly. Enough to buy passage on a train, set up a new life. You think he abandoned us? Lydia's voice was flat. You think he took our money and our horse and just left? I think it's a possibility we need to consider, Jonas said. I'm sorry, ma'am. I truly am. But a man doesn't just vanish without a trace unless he wants to. Lydia felt her legs go weak. Martha was there immediately, guiding her to a chair, pressing a cup of water into her hands. Rosie, sensing her mother's distress, began to cry. I need to know for certain, Lydia said once she could speak again. I need to know if he's dead or if he left us. I can't live not knowing. Jonas crouched down beside her chair, his gray eyes serious. I can send telegrams to the surrounding towns, put the word out. If he's alive and trying to start over, someone might spot him. But Mrs. Haley, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that we might never know what happened. Men disappear in this territory all the time. The land is too big, too wild. Sometimes people just vanish. What am I supposed to do? Lydia whispered. I have no money, no wagon train, no way to get to Fort Benton or anywhere else. I'm completely stranded. You're not stranded, Martha said firmly. You're here. And here you'll stay until we figure out what's what. I can't stay here indefinitely, Lydia protested. I need to work, need to support myself and Rosie. I can't be a burden on your household. Jonas stood, his expression thoughtful. Can you read and write? The question took Lydia by surprise. Of course, I attended finishing school in St. Louis. I can read, write, do mathematics, play piano. She stopped, suddenly embarrassed by the list of accomplishments that seemed so useless out here. But Jonas was nodding. The settlement about 5 miles north of here, they've been looking for a teacher. The last one left to get married, and they haven't found a replacement. Mostly it's ranch hands' children, maybe a dozen kids total. They meet in the back room of the general store. He paused. It doesn't pay much, but it's honest work, and it would give you a way to support yourself. Lydia stared at him. You'd help me get a teaching position? I'd put in a word, Jonas said. The rest would be up to you. But yes, I'd help, if that's what you want. What Lydia wanted was to wake up from this nightmare. She wanted to be back in St. Louis in her mother's parlor, practicing Beethoven and complaining about the heat. She wanted her husband to not be a liar and a coward. She wanted her life to make sense again. But none of those things were possible. So instead, she took a deep breath and said, Yes, I want to teach. I need to work. Then I'll ride into town tomorrow and talk to the council, Jonas said. They've been desperate for someone qualified. I expect they'll jump at the chance. After Jonas left to see to the horses, Martha began preparing dinner. Lydia sat at the table holding Rosie, her mind spinning with everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. Yesterday, she'd been part of a wagon train, married, heading toward a future she thought she understood. Today, she was alone in a stranger's house, her husband missing, her entire life in ruins. How do you do it? She asked Martha suddenly. How do you start over when everything falls apart? Martha looked up from the onions she was chopping. You just do, she said simply. One day at a time, one foot in front of the other. You cry when you need to cry. You rage when you need to rage, but you keep moving forward because the alternative is giving up. And that's not really an alternative at all. I don't feel very strong right now, Lydia admitted. Strength isn't about not being afraid or hurt, Martha said. It's about being afraid and hurt and doing what needs to be done anyway. She wiped her hands on her apron and came to sit beside Lydia. You rode through a storm with that baby in your arms. You trusted a stranger to save you. You're sitting here now making plans instead of falling apart. That's strength, child. Don't let anyone tell you different. Dinner that night was a quiet affair. The ranch hands ate quickly and retreated to the bunkhouse, leaving Jonas, Martha, and Lydia at the table. Jonas was quiet, lost in his own thoughts, occasionally glancing at Lydia with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I'll send those telegrams tomorrow," he said finally. "Fort Benton, Helena, Missoula, all the major towns. If your husband shows up anywhere, we'll hear about it." "And if he doesn't?" Lydia asked. Jonas met her eyes steadily. "Then eventually you'll have to decide what to do next. But that's not a decision you need to make tonight." After dinner, Lydia retreated to her small room with Rosie. She nursed her daughter and sang her to sleep with a lullaby her own mother had sung to her as a child. Then she sat in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling in for the night, the low voices of the cowboys in the bunkhouse, the horses moving in their stalls, the creak of the house adjusting to the cooling temperature. Somewhere out there, Thomas was either dead or alive, either a victim or a villain, either a tragedy or a betrayal. And Lydia realized with a clarity that was almost painful that she didn't know which possibility frightened her more. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called quietly. Martha entered carrying an oil lamp and a bundle of cloth. "Thought you might need these," she said, setting the lamp on the small table and unfolding the bundle to reveal several simple dresses. "They're old, but they're sturdy. If you're going to be teaching, you'll need proper clothes." "Martha, I can't keep taking from you." "You're not taking," Martha interrupted. "You're accepting. There's a difference." She sat on the edge of the bed, her weathered face kind in the lamplight. "I know everything feels impossible right now, but it gets better. Not easier necessarily, but better. You learn to carry it." "Carry what?" Lydia asked. "Whatever burden life gives you," Martha said. "Loss, disappointment, betrayal. Whatever it is, you learn to carry it. And eventually it doesn't feel quite so heavy anymore." After Martha left, Lydia lay in bed staring at the ceiling. She thought about Thomas, about the moment she'd agreed to marry him, about all the little signs she'd ignored because she wanted so badly to believe in the future he'd promised. She thought about the wagon train rolling away into the storm, leaving her behind like excess baggage. She thought about Jonas riding through hell to bring her to safety, expecting nothing in return. The world, she was learning, was full of people who'd disappoint you, but it was also full of people who'd surprise you. The trick, she supposed, was figuring out which was which before it was too late. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, Lydia dreamed of storms and empty prairies and a tall man on a tall horse, riding toward her through the rain with his hand extended, offering salvation to a stranger who had nothing left to lose. When she woke the next morning, the sun was streaming through the window again, and she could hear Jonas outside giving instructions to his men. His voice was steady and calm, the voice of a man who knew exactly what needed to be done and how to do it. Lydia got up, dressed in one of Martha's borrowed dresses, and looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand. Her face was thinner than it had been in Missouri, her skin already showing the effects of weeks of sun and wind. Her hair, once carefully curled and pinned, hung in a simple braid down her back. She looked like a different person. And maybe, she thought, that wasn't entirely a bad thing. Maybe the woman who'd left St. Louis with her head full of romantic notions about the West needed to disappear. Maybe in her place could rise someone stronger, someone who didn't need a man to define her future. "Who are you going to be now, Lydia Hale?" she asked her reflection. The woman in the mirror didn't answer, but her eyes held a determination that hadn't been there before. Lydia picked up Rosie, kissed her daughter's soft forehead, and walked out into the kitchen to face whatever this new day might bring. Jonas was there, drinking coffee and talking to Martha about fence repairs, and when he saw Lydia, he nodded respectfully and poured her a cup without being asked. It was a small gesture, simple and unremarkable, but to Lydia, in that moment, it felt like a promise that here, in this house, she would be taken care of, not because she was weak or helpless, but because that's what decent people did for each other. And for the first time since the storm, Lydia allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be all right. 3 days passed before Jonas rode into town to speak with the council about the teaching position. 3 days during which Lydia fell into a strange new rhythm at the Double R, helping Martha with cooking and cleaning, caring for Rosie, watching the ranch hands go about their work with an efficiency born of long practice. It was domestic and peaceful in a way that felt almost surreal after weeks of constant travel and uncertainty. But peace, Lydia was learning, could be its own kind of torment when you were waiting for answers that might never come. Jonas returned just before sunset on the third day, his horse kicking up dust as he rode into the yard. Lydia was sitting on the front porch with Rosie, watching the sky turn gold and pink, when he dismounted and walked toward her. His expression was unreadable, and her heart sank. "They said no," she guessed, her voice flat with disappointment. "They said yes," Jonas corrected, and something that might have been a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "They want you to start Monday. Pay is $20 a month plus room and board if you need it." Lydia's breath caught. "They said yes? Just like that?" "Well, I may have talked you up a bit," Jonas admitted, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair. "Told them you were educated, well-spoken, came from a good family back east. Also told them you were desperate for work and wouldn't run off to get married like the last teacher did." He paused. That part seemed to sell them more than anything. "Thank you," Lydia said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you for everything you've done." Jonas looked uncomfortable with her gratitude, the way he always did. "You don't owe me anything, Mrs. Hale. I'm just glad I could help." He turned to head inside, but Lydia's voice stopped him. "Jonas, wait. Can I ask you something?" He turned back, his gray eyes curious. "Of course." "Why are you doing this? And please don't say it's what anyone would do, because we both know that's not true." She shifted Rosie in her arms, choosing her words carefully. "You saved my life, gave me shelter, found me work, all for a complete stranger. Why?" Jonas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting out toward the horizon where the sun was painting the sky in impossible colors. "My father built this ranch from nothing," he said finally. "Came out here in '58 with my mother, when Montana was still wild and dangerous, and most people thought it was crazy to try ranching here. They nearly died that first winter. Would have died if not for a Crow woman who found them and taught them how to survive." He paused, his fingers absently turning his hat in his hands. "My father never forgot that. He always said that out here in country this hard, the only thing that matters is whether you help or whether you turn away. Everything else, money, property, pride, it all disappears eventually. But what you do for people, that lasts." Jonas met her eyes. "So I guess I'm doing this because my father taught me that turning away isn't an option, not if you want to be able to look at yourself in the mirror." Lydia felt tears prick her eyes. "Your father sounds like he was a good man." "He was," Jonas said quietly. "Best man I ever knew. Died 5 years ago, same month as my mother. Fever took them both within a week of each other." He put his hat back on, pulling it low. "Anyway, that's why. Nothing noble about it. Just doing what I was raised to do." He disappeared into the house before Lydia could respond, leaving her alone with the sunset and her daughter and a heart that felt too full for her chest to contain. That night, after Rosie was asleep and the house had gone quiet, Lydia sat at the small desk in her room and tried to write a letter to her mother back in St. Louis. She'd been putting it off for days, unsure what to say, how to explain the disaster her life had become. But her mother deserved to know the truth, or at least some version of it. The pen scratched across the paper, each word feeling inadequate. How did you tell your mother that her son-in-law had abandoned you in the wilderness? That you were living with strangers, dependent on their charity, with no husband and no prospects and a 3-month-old baby to support? Her mother, who'd warned her not to marry Thomas, who'd said he seemed unreliable, who'd begged her to reconsider the whole mad plan of going west. Lydia had been so certain her mother was wrong, so convinced that Thomas loved her, that their future together would be everything he'd promised. She crumpled the half-written letter and started over, then crumpled that one too. By the time Martha knocked softly on the door, Lydia was surrounded by balls of paper and no closer to knowing what to say. "Having trouble with that letter?" Martha asked, entering with 2 cups of tea. "I don't know how to tell her," Lydia admitted, accepting the tea gratefully. "My mother warned me about Thomas. She said he was charming but unstable, that I didn't know him well enough to trust him with my future. I didn't listen. I thought I knew better. And now you're afraid to admit she was right, Martha finished gently. She settled into the chair beside the desk. Pride's a funny thing. It can keep you from asking for help when you need it most. It's not just pride, Lydia said. My mother will want me to come home. She'll send money for train fare and expect me to return to St. Louis with my tail between my legs. And She stopped, surprised by the realization forming in her mind. I don't want to go back. Martha raised an eyebrow. You want to stay here, in Montana? I know it sounds crazy, Lydia said quickly. I've been here less than a week. I have no money, no security. My husband is missing, probably left me intentionally. By any reasonable measure, I should run back to civilization as fast as I can. She looked down at her tea. But when I think about going back to St. Louis, back to my mother's parlor and society teas and all those people who will whisper about poor Lydia and her failed marriage, I feel like I can't breathe. And when you think about staying here, Martha prompted. Lydia considered the question. I feel afraid, but I also feel alive. Like for the first time in my life, I get to decide who I'm going to be. Not my mother, not Thomas, not society's expectations, just me. Martha smiled. Then tell your mother the truth. Tell her you're safe, that you have work and friends and a place to stay. Tell her you'll write again soon with more details. But don't let her make decisions for you, child. This is your life now. You get to choose how it goes. After Martha left, Lydia started the letter again. This time the words came easier. She told her mother about the storm and the broken wheel, about Jonas finding them and bringing them to the ranch. She mentioned the teaching position, made it sound like an opportunity rather than a necessity. She wrote about Rosie, about how the baby was thriving in the clean Montana air. What she didn't mention was Thomas's disappearance, or her suspicions about his abandonment, or the fact that she was completely dependent on the kindness of strangers. Those truths could wait for another letter, once she'd figured out how to spin them into something more palatable. It was dishonest, maybe, but it was also survival, and Lydia was learning that survival sometimes required you to be selective with the truth. The weekend passed in a blur of preparation. Martha helped Lydia alter several dresses to fit properly, and Sarah Brennan stopped by with a donation of books and slates from her own children's schooling. Jonas brought Lydia's wagon to the ranch on Saturday, the broken wheel expertly repaired by one of his men who had a talent for carpentry. Your things are still inside, Jonas told her as they stood looking at the wagon in the yard. I didn't want to go through them without your permission. Lydia climbed into the wagon for the first time since the storm and felt her throat tighten. Everything was exactly as she'd left it. Thomas's spare shirt draped over a crate, her trunk with its precious contents, the bag of cornmeal now ruined by moisture. It felt like looking at artifacts from someone else's life. She went through everything methodically, separating what was salvageable from what was ruined. The cornmeal and most of their food supplies were lost. Thomas's clothes she folded and set aside. She didn't know what to do with them yet. Her own things she packed carefully, along with her mother's silver brush and the wedding dress she'd never wear again. At the bottom of the trunk, she found her small Bible, and inside it, pressed between the pages of Psalms, the photograph of her and Thomas on their wedding day. They looked so young in the picture, so hopeful. Thomas stood tall and handsome in his best suit, and Lydia gazed up at him like he'd hung the moon. Looking at that photograph now felt like looking at two strangers. Mrs. Hale? Jonas's voice came from outside the wagon. Everything all right? Lydia tucked the photograph back into the Bible and climbed down. Fine, just sorting through things. Jonas studied her face with those perceptive gray eyes. You find anything that might tell us where he went? No, Lydia said. Nothing like that, just memories. That night, Lydia lay awake thinking about the photograph, about the girl in that picture who'd believed so completely in fairy tales and happy endings. That girl was gone now, washed away by the storm just as surely as the wagon tracks had been. In her place was someone harder, more pragmatic, less inclined to trust pretty words and handsome smiles. She should mourn that loss, she supposed, but mostly she just felt relieved. Sunday morning, Martha insisted they all attend church in the settlement. People need to meet you before you start teaching their children, she explained, and you need to meet them. Can't teach students whose names you don't know. The church was a simple wooden building on the edge of town, its whitewashed walls bright against the endless blue sky. Horses and wagons crowded the yard, and people clustered in groups talking and laughing, dressed in their Sunday best. Conversation died when Jonas helped Lydia down from his wagon, every eye turning to examine the stranger in their midst. Lydia held Rosie close and lifted her chin, refusing to be cowed by their stares. She'd faced down St. Louis society matrons who could cut you dead with a single raised eyebrow. These frontier families didn't frighten her much. A man in his 50s approached, his weathered face friendly despite the shrewdness in his eyes. "You must be Mrs. Hale. I'm Henry Wallace, head of the town council. Jonas here spoke very highly of you." "Mr. Wallace," Lydia said, shaking his hand, "I'm grateful for the opportunity to teach. I promise I won't disappoint you." "Well, you'd have to work pretty hard to disappoint us more than our last teacher," Wallace said with a chuckle. "She spent more time flirting with the cowboys than actually teaching the children. At least you've got a baby, so we know you won't be running off to get married anytime soon." Lydia forced a smile, though the reference to her marriage, or lack thereof, stung. "I'm here to teach, Mr. Wallace. Nothing more, nothing less." "Glad to hear it." Wallace gestured toward a group of women standing near the church entrance. "My wife Alice will introduce you to the other mothers. Most of them are excited to have someone educated teaching their children. We're not all illiterate savages out here, despite what folks back east might think." The service was simple but sincere, led by a circuit preacher who traveled between settlements. Lydia sat between Martha and Jonas, very aware of the curious glances directed their way, of the whispers barely concealed behind raised hands. She knew what they were thinking, what conclusions they were drawing about a woman living at a bachelor's ranch. Let them think what they wanted. She had nothing to be ashamed of. After the service, Alice Wallace swooped in like a mothering hen, gathering Lydia into a circle of women and making introductions. Margaret Collins, whose husband ran the general store. Susan Peters, married to the blacksmith. Elizabeth Hart, wife of the town doctor. A dozen other names and faces that blurred together in Lydia's overwhelmed mind. "How old is your baby?" Margaret asked, peering at Rosie with grandmotherly affection. 3 months, Lydia answered. "Her name is Rosie." "And your husband?" Elizabeth Hart asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Jonas mentioned he went missing during the storm." Here it was, the question Lydia had been dreading. She took a breath and chose her words carefully. "My husband went hunting before the storm hit and didn't return. Jonas and his men searched for several days but found no trace. We're hoping he'll turn up eventually." The women exchanged glances laden with meaning. They knew, Lydia realized, or at least they suspected. These were frontier women, hardened by experience, and they recognized abandonment when they saw it. But instead of judgment, what Lydia saw in their faces was sympathy. "Men can be unreliable creatures," Susan Peters said bluntly. "My first husband ran off with a saloon girl when we were homesteading in Wyoming, left me with 2 babies and a half-built cabin. I know what it's like to be on your own." "You remarried?" Lydia asked. Susan smiled. "Eventually, but I spent 3 years supporting myself and my children first. Took in washing, did sewing, whatever I could find. Made me stronger than I ever thought I could be." She patted Lydia's arm. "You'll be all right, dear. You've got work and friends, and that's more than many women have." The acceptance in their voices, the understanding without pity, made Lydia's eyes burn with unexpected tears. She'd been so afraid of judgment, of being seen as a failure. But these women didn't judge her. They simply saw someone who needed help and offered it. After church, Jonas drove them back to the ranch in comfortable silence. Lydia watched the prairie roll past, golden grass rippling in the wind like waves on an endless ocean. The land was beautiful in its starkness, she realized. Harsh but honest, demanding but fair. It didn't lie to you or make promises it couldn't keep, unlike certain men she could name. "You did well today," Jonas said suddenly, breaking the silence. "I know it couldn't have been easy facing all those people." "They were kinder than I expected," Lydia admitted. "I thought they'd judge me." "Frontier people don't waste energy on judgment," Jonas said. We've all got our own problems, our own secrets. Nobody's in a position to throw stones." He paused. "Besides, what happened to you could happen to any of us. That's why we help, because we know someday we might be the one who needs it." Monday morning arrived too quickly. Lydia woke before dawn, her stomach churning with nerves. She'd taught before, informal lessons to her younger cousins, Sunday school classes at her church in St. Louis, but this felt different. This was real work, real responsibility. These children were depending on her to teach them skills they'd need to survive in this harsh country. Martha packed a lunch for her and wished her luck. Jonas had already left to work on fence repairs in the north pasture, but he'd made sure Lydia's horse was saddled and ready. One of the gentler mares, easy-gaited and patient, perfect for someone who wasn't an experienced rider. Lydia bundled Rosie into a sling against her chest. Martha had shown her how the Indian women carried their babies, leaving both hands free, and mounted the horse with more confidence than she felt. The 5-mile ride to town gave her time to think, to plan her first lessons, to imagine all the ways this could go wrong. The schoolroom was exactly as promised, the back room of Collins' general store, with a dozen mismatched chairs arranged in rows facing a battered chalkboard. Books were stacked haphazardly on shelves, slates piled in a corner, and everything had a layer of dust that spoke of weeks without use. Lydia tied her horse outside, carried Rosie and her supplies inside, and got to work. She swept the floor, wiped down the chairs, organized the books by subject and difficulty level. She wrote the alphabet on the chalkboard in her careful script and arranged the slates on a table where the youngest children could reach them. By the time the first students arrived, trailing in with their parents, the room looked almost respectable. The children ranged in age from 6 to 14, 12 students total, some eager and curious, others clearly resentful at being pulled away from ranch work to sit in a stuffy room and learn reading and arithmetic. Lydia recognized several from church, though she couldn't remember all their names. "Good morning," she said, standing at the front of the room with Rosie still sleeping in her sling. "My name is Mrs. Hale, and I'll be your teacher. Before we begin, I'd like each of you to introduce yourself and tell me one thing you hope to learn this year." They went around the room, some children confident, others shy. Tommy Wallace, Henry and Alice's grandson, wanted to learn to read well enough to understand the newspapers from back east. Sarah Collins wanted to learn penmanship. Young Billy Peters, Susan's son from her first marriage, announced that he didn't want to learn anything and was only there because his mother made him. Lydia smiled at Billy's honesty. "That's all right, Billy. You don't have to want to be here. But as long as you are here, we might as well make good use of the time. Who knows? You might surprise yourself and learn something useful." She divided them into 3 groups based on ability. The young ones just learning their letters, the middle group working on basic reading and arithmetic, and the older students ready for more advanced material. It was chaos at first, trying to give each group attention while keeping Rosie content and preventing the older boys from tormenting the younger children. But slowly, gradually, a rhythm emerged. The younger children bent over their slates, practicing letters with fierce concentration. The middle group took turns reading aloud from a primer. The older students worked on multiplication tables, some struggling, others racing through the problems with ease. Lydia found herself falling into the work, her nervousness fading as she moved between groups, offering encouragement and correction in equal measure. This was teaching stripped down to its essentials. No fancy materials, no elaborate curriculum, just knowledge being passed from one person to another in the most direct way possible. When Rosie woke and began to fuss, the younger girls immediately crowded around, begging to hold her. Lydia let them take turns, watching them cradle her daughter with surprising gentleness. These were ranch children, she realized. They'd grown up around babies, human and animal, and knew how to be careful. The morning passed quickly. At noon, Lydia dismissed the class for lunch. Most of the children had brought food from home and ate outside in the shade, their laughter and shouting a welcome break from the intensity of lessons. Margaret Collins appeared with a plate of food. "Thought you might be hungry," she said kindly. "Teaching is hard work." "Thank you," Lydia said gratefully. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until she saw the roasted chicken and fresh bread. "The children are wonderful, a bit restless, but eager to learn." "Even Billy Peters?" Margaret asked with a knowing smile. Lydia laughed. "Even Billy. He pretends not to care, but I caught him helping one of the younger boys with his letters. He's got a good heart under all that bluster." Margaret nodded approvingly. "You'll do fine here, Mrs. Hale. The children need someone who sees the good in them, not just the trouble they cause." The afternoon session focused on history and geography. Lydia used a tattered map to show the children where they were in relation to the rest of the country, then launched into a discussion of the Revolution and the Founding Fathers. The older students participated enthusiastically, but Lydia noticed the younger ones growing restless. She pivoted, asking the children to share stories about their families, where they'd come from, why they'd settled in Montana, what hardships they'd faced. Suddenly every hand was raised, every child eager to talk about their personal connection to the broader narrative of westward expansion. By the time she dismissed them at 3 o'clock, Lydia was exhausted but exhilarated. It hadn't been perfect. There'd been disruptions and confusion and moments where she'd questioned every decision, but it had been real. She'd taught actual children actual knowledge, and most of them had left smiling. The ride back to the ranch felt shorter than the morning journey. Lydia's mind was full of ideas for tomorrow's lessons, corrections she wanted to make, new approaches she wanted to try. She barely noticed the landscape passing by until Jonas appeared on the trail ahead, riding toward her. "How'd it go?" he asked, falling into step beside her. "It went," Lydia said, unable to keep the smile from her face. "It was chaotic and exhausting and wonderful. I think I actually managed to teach them something." Jonas's expression softened. "I knew you would. You've got that look about you, like you won't accept anything less than success." "Is that a compliment or a criticism?" Lydia asked. "Both, maybe," Jonas said, "but mostly a compliment. This territory needs people who refuse to quit, people who see obstacles as challenges instead of reasons to give up." They rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence, the sun warm on their backs, the prairie stretching endlessly in every direction. When the ranch house came into view, Lydia felt something unexpected. She felt like she was coming home. That evening at dinner, she told Martha and Jonas about her first day in detail, the children's names and personalities, the lessons that worked and the ones that fell flat, her plans for improving the classroom setup. Martha listened with the patient attention of someone who genuinely cared, and Jonas occasionally interjected with information about the families or the children's backgrounds. "Billy Peters," Jonas said when she mentioned the boy's reluctance. "His father abandoned them when he was just a baby. His stepfather Tom is a good man, but Billy's got a lot of anger in him. He doesn't trust easily." "He reminds me of someone," Lydia said quietly, thinking of her own anger toward Thomas, her own struggle to trust after betrayal. A week passed, then 2. Lydia settled into a routine. Early mornings at the ranch helping Martha, days in town teaching, evenings caring for Rosie and preparing lessons for the next day. It was hard work, demanding work, but it was also satisfying in a way Lydia had never experienced before. The telegrams Jonas had sent came back with no news. Thomas Hale hadn't appeared in any of the surrounding towns. No one matching his description had bought train tickets or checked into hotels. It was as if he'd simply vanished into the vast emptiness of the Montana territory. Lydia found that each day without news hurt a little less. The sharp pain of betrayal was fading into a dull ache she could carry without it consuming her. She was too busy to dwell on what she'd lost, too focused on building something new. But then, 3 weeks after she'd started teaching, everything changed. Lydia was in the classroom correcting papers when Margaret Collins burst through the door, her face flushed with excitement and something else. Apprehension, maybe, or concern. "Mrs. Hale," Margaret said, slightly breathless. "There's someone here to see you. She says it's urgent." "Who?" Lydia asked, setting down her pen. "A woman. She just arrived on the stage from Helena. She's asking for you specifically, says she knows about your husband." Margaret paused. "Mrs. Hale, she has a child with her. A little boy, maybe 2 years old." Lydia's blood turned to ice. "Where is she?" "At the hotel. She's waiting in the lobby. I told her I'd fetch you." Lydia gathered Rosie and her things with shaking hands and followed Margaret across the street to the town's small hotel. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of what Margaret had told her. A woman who knew about Thomas? A woman with a child? The hotel lobby was empty except for one person, a woman in her late 20s, dark-haired and hollow-eyed, holding a small boy on her hip. When she saw Lydia, something flickered across her face. Recognition, resignation, grief. "You're Lydia Hale," the woman said. It wasn't a question. "I am," Lydia confirmed, her voice steadier than she felt. "And you are?" The woman took a breath. "My name is Catherine Miller, and I'm very sorry to have to tell you this, but..." She shifted the boy in her arms. "I'm married to Thomas Hale, or at least I thought I was. Until I received your husband's letter 3 weeks ago, I had no idea you existed." The world tilted sideways. Lydia heard the words, understood them intellectually, but couldn't make them connect to reality. This woman was married to Thomas? Had a child with him? It was impossible. It was insane. It was, she realized with sickening certainty, entirely possible. "I think," Lydia said carefully, "we need to talk." Margaret Collins had the good sense to usher them into a private room at the back of the hotel, a small parlor where traveling salesmen sometimes took meetings. She brought coffee and closed the door behind her, leaving Lydia and Catherine alone with their children, and a truth so devastating it seemed to suck all the air from the room. Catherine sat in one of the worn chairs, her son, Daniel, she'd called him, playing quietly with a wooden horse at her feet. She looked exhausted, Lydia noticed, with dark circles under her eyes, and a tremor in her hands as she lifted her coffee cup. This woman was suffering too, had been blindsided by Thomas's deception just as surely as Lydia had been. "How long?" Lydia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How long were you married to him?" 3 years, Catherine said. "We married in Helena in the spring of 1873. Thomas said he was a businessman, that he had investments back east that required him to travel frequently. I didn't question it. He'd be gone for months at a time, then come back with money and gifts and stories about Chicago and St. Louis." She laughed bitterly. "I was so naive, so trusting." Lydia felt dizzy. 3 years. That meant Thomas had married Catherine before he'd ever met Lydia, before he'd courted her in St. Louis with his pretty words and promises of a future together. Their entire relationship had been built on lies. "When did you find out about me?" Lydia forced herself to ask. Catherine reached into her bag and pulled out a crumpled letter. "This arrived 3 weeks ago, from Thomas. He said he was leaving Helena permanently, that our marriage had been a mistake, that he'd met someone else and started a new life in Missouri." Her voice cracked. "He said he was taking his new wife west to start fresh, and that I should consider myself free to remarry, as if 3 years and a child could just be erased with a letter." She handed the letter to Lydia with shaking fingers. The handwriting was unmistakably Thomas's, that flowing script he'd always been so proud of. Lydia read the words and felt something inside her break cleanly, like a bone snapping. "I didn't know," Lydia said, handing the letter back. "I swear to you, I had no idea he was already married. He told me he was a widower, that his first wife had died of fever in California. He seemed so sincere, so heartbroken when he talked about her." She looked at Catherine. "Was any of it true? Anything at all?" "I don't know," Catherine admitted. "I've spent 3 weeks trying to figure out who Thomas really was, and I'm no closer to an answer. He lied about everything, his name, his business, his past. For all I know, Thomas Hale isn't even his real name." The two women sat in silence, absorbing the enormity of their shared betrayal. Lydia looked at Daniel playing with his wooden horse, then at Rosie sleeping in her arms. 2 children, 2 women, 1 man who'd destroyed multiple lives with his selfishness and cowardice. "Why did you come here?" Lydia asked finally. "How did you even find me?" "The letter mentioned he was taking you to Montana Territory, to Fort Benton," Catherine explained. "I sold everything I had, bought a stage ticket, and started asking questions at every settlement between Helena and Fort Benton. In the last town, someone mentioned a wagon train that had passed through, and a woman with a baby who'd been left behind when her wagon broke down. A woman named Hale." She met Lydia's eyes. "I had to know if it was you. Had to know if he'd abandoned you too." "He went hunting the day before the storm and never came back," Lydia said flatly. "Took our horse, our mule, and $300 we'd saved for buying land. Jonas Reeves, the rancher I'm staying with, searched for days but found nothing. Catherine's expression hardened. The money. Of course. That's what this was all about, wasn't it? He married me for my inheritance, probably married you for yours. Used one wife to fund his trips to court the other, then took everything he could carry and disappeared. I don't have an inheritance, Lydia said. My family has money, but my father didn't believe in giving daughters independent wealth. Everything I brought to the marriage came from Thomas himself, from his so-called business investments. She paused. Which were probably your money all along. The realization settled over them like a shroud. Thomas had been running a confidence scheme, supporting one wife with money stolen from the other, moving between them like some kind of traveling salesman peddling lies instead of goods. What are we going to do? Catherine asked, and for the first time Lydia heard genuine fear in her voice. I have no money left. I spent everything I had getting here. And you? I have a teaching position, Lydia interrupted. $20 a month. Not much, but it's honest work. She looked at Catherine, really looked at her, and saw a reflection of her own desperation and determination. Can you sew? Catherine blinked at the apparent non sequitur. Yes. I was a seamstress in Helena before I married Thomas. Why? Because this territory needs seamstresses, Lydia said, an idea forming in her mind. The women here make their own clothes, but most of them aren't skilled at it. Alterations, mending, making dresses from patterns. There's work for someone who knows what they're doing. I can't just set up shop with no money, Catherine protested. No, Lydia agreed. But you could stay at the Double R, the ranch where I've been living. Martha Quinn, the housekeeper, she'd welcome another pair of hands. And Jonas Reeves, he's a good man, the one who found me after the storm. He'd help you get established. He helped me. Catherine looked at Lydia with something approaching wonder. After everything Thomas did, after finding out you were never really his wife, you'd help me? You're not my enemy, Lydia said simply. We're both victims of the same man's cruelty, and out here, women need to help each other. It's the only way any of us survive. They talked for another hour, piecing together the timeline of Thomas's deceptions, comparing stories and discovering just how thoroughly he'd fooled them both. Thomas had been clever. Lydia had to give him that. He'd chosen wives in different territories, far enough apart that they'd never accidentally meet. He'd timed his absences carefully, always with plausible explanations. And he'd been charming enough that neither woman had seriously questioned his stories until it was too late. Do you think he's dead? Catherine asked as the afternoon light began to fade. Or do you think he's somewhere starting over with a third wife? Lydia considered the question. Part of her hoped he was dead, that some accident or misfortune had claimed him in the storm. It would be easier than knowing he was out there, living comfortably while they struggled with the wreckage he'd left behind. But another part of her, a harder part that was still emerging, hoped he was alive. Hoped that someday, somehow, he'd face consequences for what he'd done. I don't know, she said honestly, and I'm not sure it matters anymore. We can't change what happened. We can only decide what we do next. Catherine nodded slowly. Then I accept your offer. If this Jonas Reeves will have me, I'll stay at the ranch and start over. She looked down at Daniel. My son deserves better than a mother who's given up. They returned to the Double R as the sun was setting, Lydia riding her mare while Catherine and Daniel traveled in a wagon Jonas had sent when Margaret Collins rode out to inform him of the situation. Jonas met them in the yard, his face grave but unsurprised. Margaret had clearly filled him in on the basics. Martha emerged from the house, took one look at Catherine's exhausted face, and immediately went into mothering mode. You poor dear. Come inside. Let's get you and the boys settled. You look like you haven't eaten a decent meal in days. While Martha fussed over Catherine and Daniel, Jonas drew Lydia aside. Margaret told me, he said quietly, about the other wife. I'm sorry, Mrs. Hale. That's a hard thing to learn. It's just Lydia, she said, the words coming out more sharply than she intended. I was never really Mrs. Hale. That marriage was a fraud from the beginning. Jonas's expression was understanding. What you were calling yourself doesn't change who you are, and what he did doesn't define you. Lydia felt tears prick her eyes, but refused to let them fall. She'd cried enough over Thomas Hale. Catherine needs work. She's a skilled seamstress. I thought maybe she can stay here, Jonas interrupted. Same arrangement as you, room and board in exchange for helping around the ranch. And I'll talk to the women in town about sewing work. I expect they'll be glad to have someone who knows what they're doing." "You're very generous," Lydia said. Jonas shrugged, uncomfortable as always with gratitude. "It's just practical. Martha needs help with the cooking and cleaning, and we've got the space. Besides, a child Daniel's age will be good for morale around here. The Cowboys like having young ones about. Reminds them of their own families back home." That night, after both children were asleep and Martha had retired to her room, Lydia found herself on the front porch with Catherine, both women wrapped in shawls against the cool evening air. The prairie stretched dark and endless before them, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. "Thank you," Catherine said softly, "for helping me. You didn't have to." "Yes, I did," Lydia replied, "because someone helped me when I needed it most. Because that's what decent people do." She paused. "And because we're in this together now, whether we like it or not. Thomas connected us, but we don't have to let him define us." Catherine was quiet for a moment. "What's he like?" "Jonas Reeves?" Lydia considered the question. "He's quiet, kind. The sort of man who does the right thing because it doesn't occur to him to do anything else. He saved my life without hesitation, gave me shelter and work, and never once made me feel like a burden." She smiled slightly. "He's everything Thomas pretended to be." "Are you in love with him?" Catherine asked bluntly. The question caught Lydia off guard. "No, I barely know him, and even if I did, and I'm not ready for that. Maybe I never will be. Thomas broke something in me, some ability to trust that I'm not sure can be repaired." "I understand that," Catherine said. "I look at Daniel and I think about how I'll teach him about men, about relationships. How do I tell him to be honest and trustworthy when his own father was neither of those things?" "You teach him by showing him better examples," Lydia said. "Men like Jonas, like Tom Peters, Susan's husband, who took in another man's children and raised them as his own. Like Henry Wallace, who's been married to Alice for 30 years and still looks at her like she hung the moon." She turned to Catherine. "Thomas was a liar and a coward, but that doesn't mean all men are. We just have to be smarter about recognizing the difference." The next few weeks brought changes to the household at the Double R. Catherine settled in quickly, taking over much of the cooking from Martha and transforming a small storage room into a makeshift sewing space. Word spread through the settlement about the skilled seamstress at the Reeves Ranch, and within days, women were arriving with fabric and requests for dresses, alterations, and mending. Catherine worked with focused intensity, as if keeping her hands busy kept her mind from dwelling on darker thoughts. She was good at her craft, Lydia noticed. Her stitches were tiny and even, her eye for fit and style impeccable. The women who received their finished garments were delighted, and more work followed. "You have a gift," Lydia told her one evening as they sat together in the kitchen, Catherine sewing while Lydia corrected papers. "It's just practice," Catherine demurred. "My mother was a seamstress. She taught me young." "Is she still alive? Your mother?" Catherine's face clouded. "She died when I was 16. That's when I came west, actually. Had nothing keeping me in Ohio, and I'd always dreamed of seeing new places." She smiled bitterly. "Be careful what you wish for, right?" Lydia reached across the table to squeeze her hand. They'd developed an easy friendship in the short time they'd known each other, bound by shared trauma, but also by genuine affection. Catherine was sharp-witted and practical, with a dark sense of humor that emerged when she felt safe enough to lower her guard. She made Lydia laugh, something that had seemed impossible just weeks ago. Jonas watched their growing friendship with quiet approval. He'd taken to joining them on the porch some evenings, sharing coffee and conversation after the day's work was done. He was good with Daniel, Lydia noticed, patient and gentle, teaching the boy to whistle and showing him how to identify different birds by their calls. "You're good with children," Lydia observed one evening when Daniel had fallen asleep against Jonas's shoulder. Jonas looked down at the boy with an expression Lydia couldn't quite read. "I always wanted children of my own," he admitted. "But that requires a wife, and I've never been much good at courting. Ranching doesn't leave much time for social niceties." "The right woman won't care about social niceties," Catherine said from her sewing. "She'll care about whether you're decent and honest and willing to work hard. Everything else is just window dressing." Jonas carried Daniel inside to his bed, and Lydia found herself thinking about his words. He wanted children, wanted a family. He was exactly the kind of man who should have those things. Solid, dependable, genuinely good. It seemed unfair that men like Jonas remained alone while men like Thomas collected wives like playing cards. The world, Lydia was learning, was spectacularly unfair. A month after Catherine's arrival, Jonas received a telegram from Helena. He read it at breakfast, his expression darkening, then handed it across the table to Lydia without a word. The telegram was brief. Body found near Helena, male, late 20s, matches description. Please advise. Sheriff Morris. Lydia's hand trembled as she passed the telegram to Catherine. They found him. Or they found someone who looks like him, Catherine said, but her voice was shaking too. We won't know for certain until someone identifies the body. Jonas stood, already reaching for his hat. I'll ride to Helena. Should take 3 days there and back if I push hard. I can... No, Lydia interrupted. I need to go. If it's Thomas, if he's really dead, I need to see it with my own eyes. Otherwise, I'll always wonder. I'll go with you, Catherine said immediately. We both should see. We both deserve to know. Martha protested. A 6-day journey was no small undertaking, especially with 2 small children. But Lydia was adamant, and Jonas, seeing the determination in her eyes, didn't try to dissuade her. Then I'm coming with you, he said firmly. Both of you. We'll take the wagon, travel at a reasonable pace. Martha can look after the children while we're gone. They left the next morning at dawn, the wagon loaded with supplies for the journey. Martha stood on the porch holding Rosie and Daniel, her weathered face worried but understanding. You be careful, she called, and come back safe. The journey to Helena took 2.5 days of steady travel across prairie that gradually gave way to more rugged terrain. Jonas drove the wagon with quiet competence while Lydia and Catherine sat in back, talking or silent by turns, processing what they might find at the end of this journey. What if it's not him? Catherine asked on the second day. What if we go all this way and it's just some stranger who happened to match the description? Then we come home and keep living, Lydia said. But if it is him... She trailed off, unsure how to finish that sentence. If it is him, then we have proof, Catherine finished. Proof that he's gone, that he can't hurt anyone else. Proof that we can finally stop looking over our shoulders. Helena was larger than Lydia had expected, a bustling town that had grown prosperous from mining and trade. Jonas drove them straight to the sheriff's office, a squat building near the center of town. Sheriff Morris was a grizzled man in his 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. Mrs. Hale? He asked when they entered. Or should I say, both Mrs. Hales? Just call us by our Christian names, Lydia said tiredly. Lydia and Catherine. The title of Mrs. Hale seems to have lost all meaning. Morris nodded understandingly. Fair enough. I want to warn you ladies before we proceed. The body was in the water for some time. It's not pleasant to look at. We understand, Catherine said, her voice steady despite the pallor of her face. We need to see. The sheriff led them to a building behind his office that served as the town's morgue. Jonas stayed close to Lydia's side, a solid presence she was grateful for. Inside, a sheet-covered form lay on a table in the center of the room. Sheriff Morris paused with his hand on the sheet. Ready? Both women nodded, gripping each other's hands. The sheriff pulled back the sheet. Lydia looked at the body and felt a strange mix of emotions wash over her. Relief, grief, anger, vindication. The man on the table had once been handsome, but death in water had not been kind. Still, the features were unmistakable. It's him, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. That's Thomas Hale. Catherine was crying silently, tears streaming down her face. How did he die? Drowned, Sheriff Morris said, covering the body again. We found him in a creek about 15 miles northwest of here. Looks like his horse threw him during a storm. We found the horse dead nearby, broken leg. Best we can figure, Mr. Hale hit his head when he fell, ended up in the creek, and drowned. Body got wedged under some rocks, which is why it took so long to find. Was there anything on him? Jonas asked. Money? Personal effects? Morris pulled out a small box. This was in his saddlebags, $347, a pocket watch, and these. He opened the box to reveal two wedding rings, one that Lydia recognized as hers, one that must have been Catherine's. He kept them, Catherine whispered. After everything, after abandoning us both, he kept our rings. Lydia stared at the rings, trying to understand what they meant. Was Thomas sentimental, guilty, or had he simply viewed them as assets to be sold when needed? She'd never know now. Thomas had taken his motivations, his reasons, his true self to the grave with him. The money, Lydia said. Can we— It's yours, Sheriff Morris interrupted. Both of yours, I suppose, though dividing it is your business, not mine. As for the rings, same thing. You ladies can decide what to do with them. They stayed in Helena overnight at a modest hotel, too exhausted and emotionally drained to attempt the journey back. Jonas got his own room while Lydia and Catherine shared, lying awake in the darkness and talking in low voices. I thought I'd feel something, Catherine said. When I saw him dead, I thought I'd feel relief or satisfaction or grief. But I just felt empty. I know, Lydia agreed. Like closing a book you never really enjoyed reading in the first place. You're glad it's over, but you also resent the time it wasted. What do we do with the money? Catherine asked. Lydia had been thinking about that. Split it evenly. $173 each. It's not a fortune, but it's a start. You can use your share to set up a proper sewing business. I can put mine aside for Rosie, for her future. And the rings? Sell them, Lydia said without hesitation, or throw them in the deepest river we can find. Either way, I never want to see mine again. They sold the rings to a jeweler in Helena the next morning for $30, which they also split. Then they climbed into Jonas's wagon and began the journey home. Home to the Double R, to Martha and the children, to the lives they were building from the ruins Thomas had left behind. Jonas was quiet on the journey back, but Lydia caught him glancing at her several times with an expression she couldn't quite read. Concern, certainly. But something else too, something warmer and more complex. On the last night of the journey, they made camp under a vast sky full of stars. Catherine fell asleep quickly, exhausted by travel and emotion, leaving Lydia and Jonas sitting by the fire. You holding up all right? Jonas asked quietly. I think so, Lydia said. It's strange. I thought I'd feel more when I saw him dead, but mostly I just felt relieved. Relieved that it's over, that I know the truth, that I can stop wondering and start living. Jonas poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness. You've been through more in 2 months than most people go through in a lifetime. You're allowed to feel however you feel. How do you always know the right thing to say? Lydia asked. Jonas smiled slightly. I don't. I just try to say what's true and hope it's helpful. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the prairie sounds, crickets chirping, wind rustling through grass, somewhere far off a coyote's lonely cry. What will you do now? Jonas asked. Now that you know he's gone for certain? Lydia considered the question. Keep teaching. Keep helping Catherine get her business established. Keep being a mother to Rosie. She paused. Keep living at the Double R if you'll have me, unless my presence has become an imposition. You're not an imposition, Jonas said firmly. Neither of you are. The ranch is better with you both there, livelier. More like a home instead of just a place to work and sleep. Lonely? Lydia guessed. Jonas met her eyes across the fire. Yes, lonely. I didn't realize how lonely until you and Catherine and the children arrived. Now I can't imagine the house without you. Something in the way he said it made Lydia's heart beat faster, but she pushed the feeling away, not ready to examine it too closely. She'd been married to one man who'd turned out to be a stranger. She wasn't ready to risk her heart on another. But sitting there by the fire with Jonas, watching the way the flames painted shadows across his honest face, Lydia thought that maybe, someday, when enough time had passed and enough healing had occurred, she might be willing to try again. Not with a charming liar who made pretty promises, but with a quiet, steady man who kept his word and did the right thing simply because it was right. With someone like Jonas Reeves. They arrived back at the Double R to find Martha on the porch with both children, waiting for them as if she'd known the exact moment they'd return. Rosie squealed when she saw Lydia, reaching out her little arms, and Lydia felt her heart overflow with love and gratitude. This was her family now. Not blood, not law, but choice. Martha with her gruff kindness, Catherine with her sharp wit and shared understanding, Jonas with his quiet strength and steady presence, the children who filled the house with laughter, and somewhere in the Montana earth, Thomas Hale was buried and gone, his deceptions finally over, his hold on them broken forever. Lydia looked at the ranch house, sturdy and weathered, standing firm against whatever the territory threw at it, and thought that it was exactly the right metaphor for what she wanted to become. Strong, resilient, rooted in truth instead of pretty lies. She was Lydia Hale still, technically, until she could afford the legal fees to reclaim her maiden name. But that was just paperwork, just a technicality. In her heart, she was already someone new, someone who'd survived a storm and come out stronger on the other side, someone who'd been left behind and found a better way forward, someone who'd learned that home wasn't a place you arrived at, but something you built with the people who refused to leave you behind. The winter came early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with a ferocity that caught even the old-timers by surprise. By late October, the first snow had fallen, blanketing the prairie in white and transforming the Double R into something out of a picture book. Lydia stood at the kitchen window watching the flakes drift down, Rosie balanced on her hip, and marveled at how much had changed since that terrible storm 4 months ago. She'd been teaching for 3 months now, and the schoolroom had become her second home. The children had progressed remarkably. Even Billy Peters, who'd started the year claiming he didn't want to learn anything, was now reading at a level that surprised everyone, including himself. Their parents praised Lydia at church and in town, thanking her for giving their children opportunities they'd never dreamed possible. Catherine's sewing business had flourished beyond anyone's expectations. Women came from settlements 20 miles away to commission dresses, and Catherine had recently hired Susan Peters to help with the simpler alterations. The two women worked side by side in the converted storage room, their conversation and laughter drifting through the house like music. The Double R felt alive in a way Jonas said it never had before. Martha hummed while she cooked. Catherine sang while she sewed. The children filled the rooms with their noise and energy, and Jonas smiled more. The ranch hands had noticed it too, commenting among themselves about how their boss seemed lighter somehow, less burdened by the weight of running everything alone. But beneath the surface of this new domestic harmony, Lydia felt something building, some unspoken tension between herself and Jonas that grew stronger with each passing day. The way his eyes lingered on her at dinner, the way her heart jumped when he entered a room, the careful distance they maintained as if both were afraid that getting too close might shatter the fragile peace they'd built. It was Sarah Brennan who finally forced the issue into the open. She arrived one afternoon in early November, ostensibly to pick up a dress Catherine had finished for her, but Lydia suspected she had other motives. Sarah had a way of knowing things, of seeing beneath the surface to truths people tried to hide. "Walk with me," Sarah said to Lydia after collecting her dress. "It's too beautiful a day to spend entirely indoors." They bundled up against the cold and walked toward the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property, their breath forming clouds in the crisp air. Sarah waited until they were well away from the house before speaking. "How long are you planning to let this continue?" she asked bluntly. Lydia feigned innocence. "Let what continue?" "You and Jonas circling each other like nervous horses," Sarah said. "Everyone can see it except apparently the two of you. Or maybe you do see it and you're both too scared to do anything about it." Lydia felt her cheeks flush, and not from the cold. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," Sarah said gently. "Lydia, I know you've been hurt. I know Thomas's betrayal cut deep, and you're afraid to trust again. But Jonas Reeves is not Thomas Hale. He's honest and decent, and he's been half in love with you since the day he found you in that storm." "He has not," Lydia protested, but her voice lacked conviction. Sarah laughed. "Oh, honey, everyone knows. The ranch hands bet on when he'll finally work up the courage to court you properly. Martha's already planning the wedding in her head. The only two people who seem oblivious are you and Jonas." Lydia stopped walking, staring at Sarah. "Even if that were true, which I'm not saying it is, I can't. I'm not ready. Maybe I'll never be ready." "Why not?" Sarah challenged. Because one man was the liar? Because you made a mistake trusting the wrong person? That's not a reason to close yourself off from someone who's proven himself trustworthy 100 times over. It's more complicated than that, Lydia said. I have Rosie to think about. I have my teaching position. I've built a life here that doesn't depend on any man. Why would I risk that? Because, Sarah said softly, a life lived alone out of fear is only half a life. And because Jonas isn't asking you to depend on him, he's offering to build something together, as equals. There's a difference. They walked back to the house in silence, Sarah's words echoing in Lydia's mind. That evening, as they all sat around the dinner table, Jonas at one end, Martha at the other, Lydia and Catherine on the sides with the children between them, Lydia found herself watching Jonas with new awareness. The way he carved meat for Daniel's plate without being asked. The way he listened intently when Martha talked about her day. The way his eyes found Lydia's across the table and held them for just a moment too long. Sarah was right. Something was building between them, had been building for months, and Lydia was terrified of it. After dinner, Jonas asked Lydia to walk with him to check on the horses. It was a transparent excuse. The ranch hands had already done the evening rounds, but Lydia found herself agreeing anyway. They walked to the barn in comfortable silence, the snow crunching under their boots, the stars brilliant overhead in the clear, cold sky. Inside the barn, the horses nickered softly in their stalls, the smell of hay and leather and horse warm and familiar. Jonas lit a lantern and hung it from a hook, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "Lydia," he said, then stopped, seeming to struggle with his words. "I need to tell you something, and I'm not good at this sort of thing, so I'm just going to say it straight." Lydia's heart hammered against her ribs. "All right." Jonas took a breath. "I know it hasn't been long since Thomas died. I know you're still healing from what he did to you, but I can't keep pretending I don't have feelings for you. It's making me crazy, watching you every day, wanting to tell you how remarkable I think you are, how much I admire your strength and your courage and the way you've rebuilt your life from nothing." "Jonas," Lydia started, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish. Please." He ran his hand through his hair, a gesture Lydia had come to recognize as a sign of nervousness. "I'm not asking you to marry me. I'm not even asking you to court me, not if you're not ready. But I am asking you to consider the possibility, someday, when enough time has passed, if you think you could ever see me as more than just the man who gave you shelter." Lydia felt tears prick her eyes. "Is that what you think? That I see you as just charity? Just someone who helped me because he had to?" "Don't you?" Jonas asked quietly. "No," Lydia said firmly. She stepped closer to him, close enough to see the flecks of blue in his gray eyes. "Jonas, you saved my life. But more than that, you gave me the tools to save myself. You found me work, helped me build independence, never once made me feel like I owed you anything. You've been patient and kind, and you've never pressured me or expected anything in return." She paused. "And yes, I have feelings for you too. I've been trying not to, trying to convince myself it's too soon, that I'm not ready, that I'll just end up hurt again. But the truth is what?" Jonas prompted when she trailed off. "The truth is I'm scared," Lydia admitted. "I'm terrified of trusting someone again, of believing in a future that might just be more lies. Thomas broke something in me, Jonas. I don't know if it can be fixed." Jonas reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and took her hand in his. His palm was rough and warm, calloused from years of hard work. "Then we'll take it slow," he said. "However slow you need. I'm not going anywhere, Lydia. I'll wait as long as it takes." Standing there in the barn with the horses breathing softly around them and the lantern light making everything warm and golden, Lydia felt something inside her shift. Not breaking, but opening, like a door she'd locked tight was finally, cautiously, beginning to swing open. "What if I'm never ready?" she whispered. "What if the damage is permanent?" "Then we'll figure it out together," Jonas said simply. "But I don't think it is. I think you're one of the strongest people I've ever met, and I think you're capable of healing. It just takes time." Lydia looked at their joined hands, then up at Jonas's face, open and honest and full of a hope he wasn't trying to hide. And she made a decision. "Ask me," she said. Jonas blinked. Ask you what? To court me, Lydia said. Properly. The way people do when they're taking things slow and seeing if they're compatible. Ask me. A smile spread across Jonas's face, transforming it. Lydia Hale, would you do me the honor of allowing me to court you, with the understanding that we'll take things as slow as you need and that there's no pressure or expectation beyond getting to know each other better? Yes, Lydia said, and felt the last of her fear dissolve. Yes, I'd like that very much. Jonas squeezed her hand gently, then released it, stepping back to a respectful distance. Then I suppose we should head back to the house before Martha sends out a search party. They walked back through the snow, not touching but somehow closer than they'd ever been. When they entered the kitchen, Catherine took one look at their faces and broke into a knowing smile. Finally, she said, I thought you two were going to dance around each other forever. Martha snorted from her chair by the fire. About time. I was starting to think I'd have to lock them in the barn together. Lydia felt her face flame. You all knew? Honey, everyone knew, Catherine said, except apparently you two. She set down her sewing and came to hug Lydia. I'm happy for you, both of you. You deserve this. The winter deepened, but inside the double R, warmth and contentment reigned. Jonas courted Lydia with old-fashioned propriety, afternoon walks, conversations on the porch after dinner, small gifts left where she'd find them, a book he'd ordered from Helena because she'd mentioned wanting to read it, wildflowers preserved in wax when he'd heard her say she missed seeing color in the winter landscape, a rocking chair he'd built himself for her classroom so she could nurse Rosie comfortably during the school day. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. Jonas told her about growing up on the ranch, about his parents and their enduring love, about his sister Caroline and how almost losing her had changed him. Lydia told him about St. Louis, about the life she'd left behind, about the girl she'd been before Thomas and the woman she was becoming after him. Do you miss it? Jonas asked one evening as they sat in the parlor while the others had retired. Your old life? Lydia considered the question honestly. Sometimes I miss specific things. My mother's piano, the way the Mississippi looked at sunset, the ease of having everything provided for me. She paused. But I don't miss who I was there. That girl was shallow and naive, with no idea how hard life could be. I like who I'm becoming here better. Strong and independent and a little bit fierce, Jonas said with a smile. Is that how you see me? Lydia asked. That's how everyone sees you, Jonas said. The children at school worship you. The mothers in town respect you. Catherine says you saved her life when she had nowhere else to turn. He met her eyes. And I see a woman who was knocked down by life and got back up swinging. In December, the town held a Christmas social at the church. The whole community turned out, dressed in their finest, bringing food and music and laughter to chase away the winter darkness. Jonas asked Lydia to dance, and she accepted, very aware of every eye in the room watching them. They're all staring, she whispered as Jonas led her onto the floor. Let them stare, Jonas said. I'm dancing with the most beautiful woman in Montana Territory. I'd be disappointed if they weren't jealous. Lydia laughed despite her nervousness. Jonas wasn't a particularly graceful dancer. He moved with the same practical efficiency he brought to everything else. But he was steady and sure, and Lydia felt safe in his arms. Across the room, she saw Catherine dancing with Tom Peters, Susan's husband, and looking happier than Lydia had seen her since Helena. Daniel played with the other children, shrieking with laughter, fully integrated into the community. Martha sat with Alice Wallace and the other older women, all of them watching the dancers with fond expressions. This was her community now, Lydia realized. These people who'd welcomed her when she had nothing, who'd given her work and friendship and acceptance. She'd come west expecting to build a life with Thomas, but instead she'd found something better. A life she'd built herself, surrounded by people who valued her for who she was rather than who she'd married. After the dance, Jonas walked her outside for some air. The night was cold and clear, the stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. They stood on the church steps watching their breath form clouds in the frigid air. Lydia, Jonas said, his voice serious, I know we agreed to take things slow, and I'm prepared to keep that promise for as long as you need, but I also think you should know that I love you. I'm in love with you, And whenever you're ready, whether that's 6 months from now or 6 years, I want to marry you." Lydia's breath caught. It was too soon, her mind insisted. Thomas had been dead barely 4 months. Society would say she was moving too fast, being inappropriate, not respecting proper mourning periods. But her heart, that part of her that Thomas hadn't managed to destroy, knew something her mind didn't want to admit. She loved Jonas too. Had loved him for a while now, probably since that first morning when she'd woken up in his house and he'd poured her coffee without being asked, treating her like a person rather than a problem to be solved. "I love you too," she said quietly, surprising herself with the admission. "I've been trying not to, trying to tell myself it's too soon, but I can't help it. You're everything I thought Thomas was and everything he should have been. You're real and honest and good, and I—" Her voice broke. "I'm so grateful that storm brought me to you." Jonas pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against the cold and the darkness and all the fears that still sometimes woke her in the night. "Then marry me," he said. "Not today, not even this year if you're not ready, but someday. Say you'll marry me someday." Lydia pulled back to look at his face, at those steady gray eyes that had never once lied to her. "Yes," she said. "Someday, when I've had time to heal properly, when we've had time to know each other even better. I'll marry you, Jonas Reeves." He kissed her then, softly and carefully, like she was something precious that might break. It was nothing like the passionate kisses Thomas had given her during their courtship, those kisses that had been all heat and no substance. This kiss was gentle and sweet and full of promise, the kiss of a man who understood that love was built slowly, carefully, with patience and respect. When they pulled apart, Lydia saw tears on Jonas's cheeks. She reached up to wipe them away with her gloved hand. "I won't let you down," he said. "I swear to you, Lydia. I'll spend the rest of my life proving that you can trust me." "I know," Lydia said simply. "That's why I said yes." They walked back inside hand in hand, and if anyone thought it was too soon, if anyone whispered about propriety or proper mourning, Lydia didn't hear them. She was too full of hope and joy and the strange, wonderful realization that sometimes the worst things that happen to you could lead to the best things. Spring came eventually, as it always did, melting the snow and turning the prairie green again. Lydia's teaching contract was renewed for another year with a raise, $25 a month now, recognition of how much the children had learned under her instruction. Catherine's sewing business was thriving, with more orders than she could handle, even with Susan's help. They'd started talking about opening an actual shop in town, though that was still just a dream for the future. On a warm day in late April, almost exactly a year after the storm that had changed everything, Jonas took Lydia back to the spot where he'd found her. The broken wagon was long gone, but the place was still recognizable. A slight depression in the earth where the wheels had rutted, grass growing thick and green over what had once been mud. "I almost rode past," Jonas admitted as they stood looking at the spot. "It was dark and raining so hard I could barely see. But something made me look twice, made me stop." He turned to her. "I believe it was Providence. We were meant to find each other." "But I don't know if I believe in Providence," Lydia said, "but I believe in second chances. And I believe that sometimes the road that breaks beneath you is the one that leads you home." Jonas smiled. "Is that what this place is for you? Home?" Lydia thought about the question. A year ago, she would have said home was St. Louis, was her mother's parlor and her childhood bedroom. 6 months ago, she might have said home was the double R, was Martha's kitchen and the small room where she slept with Rosie. But now she understood that home wasn't a place at all. "Home is wherever you are," she said. "You and Martha and Catherine and the children. Home is the life we've all built together." They were married in June, on a golden afternoon with the whole settlement in attendance. Catherine stood up with Lydia, holding Rosie during the ceremony, while Sarah Brennan played piano and Martha cried happy tears into her handkerchief. Daniel, now 3 years old and energetic as a puppy, served as ring bearer and took his duties very seriously. Lydia wore a dress Catherine had made specially for the occasion, simple but elegant cream-colored silk with delicate embroidery around the collar. Nothing like the elaborate wedding gown she'd worn to marry Thomas, and all the better for it. That girl who'd worn that dress was gone. In her place stood a woman who knew her own strength, who'd survived abandonment and betrayal and come out whole on the other side. Jonas wore his father's vest again, the same one he'd worn to every important occasion since his father died. His hands shook as he slid the ring onto Lydia's finger. Not the ring Thomas had given her, which had been sold in Helena, but a new one Jonas had commissioned specially, with a small sapphire the color of Montana sky. I, Jonas Reeves, take you, Lydia Hale, to be my lawfully wedded wife, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. I promise to be honest with you always, to respect your independence, to support your dreams, and to love you through whatever storms may come. I found you on the worst day of your life, and I consider it the best day of mine. Lydia's vows were equally simple and equally heartfelt. I, Lydia Hale, take you, Jonas Reeves, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to trust you, to build a life with you as equal partners, to love you not because I need you, but because I choose you. You saved my life, but more importantly, you gave me back to myself. And I will spend the rest of my days grateful for that gift. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the church erupted in applause and cheers. Jonas kissed Lydia thoroughly, to the delight of the cowboys and the scandalized amusement of the older women, and Lydia kissed him back with her whole heart. The reception was held at the Double R, with tables set up in the yard and food enough to feed an army. The ranch hands had strung lanterns from the trees, and someone had brought a fiddle, and people danced and laughed and celebrated until the stars came out. Catherine cornered Lydia near midnight, both of them watching the festivities from the porch. Happy? Catherine asked. Deliriously, Lydia admitted. A year ago, if someone had told me I'd be here now, married to Jonas and happy about it, I wouldn't have believed them. Life is strange that way, Catherine said. The worst things and the best things all tangled up together, impossible to separate. Thomas led me to you, and you led me to this place, and now we've both found something better than what we lost. Have you? Lydia asked. She knew Catherine had been spending time with Tom Peters since Susan had given her blessing, even encouraged it, saying Tom deserved happiness and so did Catherine. Catherine blushed. He hasn't asked yet, but I think he will. And when he does, she smiled. When he does, I think I'll say yes. Not because I need a husband, but because Tom is a good man who understands that I come with baggage and loves me anyway. Then we'll be sisters twice over, Lydia said, by choice and by marriage. They hugged. These two women who'd been bound by betrayal and had chosen to turn that bond into something beautiful, a friendship that had sustained them both through the darkest times. Jonas found Lydia on the porch as the last guests were leaving. He held out his hand. Ready to go to bed, Mrs. Reeves? Lydia took his hand, marveling at how natural her new name sounded. I am, though I have to admit I'm more tired than romantic right now. Jonas laughed. Then we'll sleep. We have the rest of our lives for everything else. They walked upstairs together, to the bedroom that had been Jonas's alone for so long and was now theirs to share. The room had been transformed. Martha and Catherine had hung new curtains, brought in a larger bed, added touches that made it feel less like a bachelor's quarters and more like a space for two. Lydia changed into her nightgown while Jonas waited outside, then called him in. He looked nervous, she noticed, for the first time all day. I know we're married now, he said carefully. But I want you to know there's no pressure. We can take things as slow as you need. Lydia crossed the room to him, standing close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. I'm not afraid anymore, she said. Not of you, not of this. You've spent a year proving that you're trustworthy, Jonas. I believe you, I trust you, and I want this, want us, completely. What followed was tender and careful, Jonas treating her like she was precious, taking his time, making sure she felt safe and cherished every moment. It was nothing like her wedding night with Thomas, which had been awkward and rushed and ultimately disappointing. This was what intimacy was supposed to be. Two people who truly knew and cared for each other, choosing to be vulnerable together. Afterward, lying in Jonas's arms with her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat slow and steady, Lydia felt a peace she'd never known before. This was right. This was real. This was the future she'd been meant for all along. Thank you, she whispered into the darkness. For what? Jonas asked sleepily, his hand stroking her hair. For riding out into that storm, for bringing me home, for being patient, for loving me even when I was too scared to love you back. She lifted her head to look at him, for being everything Thomas wasn't. Jonas cupped her face in his hands. I didn't do anything special, Lydia. I just saw someone who needed help and offered it. Any decent person would have done the same. But they didn't, Lydia said. The wagon train didn't. They chose 200 people over 2. You chose differently, and that choice changed everything. They fell asleep tangled together, the Montana night quiet and peaceful around them, the future stretching out bright and full of promise. The years that followed were good ones. Lydia continued teaching, becoming one of the most respected educators in the territory. Some of her students went on to college back east, carrying with them the foundation she'd given them. Catherine married Tom Peters in a small ceremony the following spring, and their combined family, her Daniel, his 2 children from his first marriage, and eventually 3 more they had together, filled the Peters house with joy and chaos. Martha lived to see her 80th birthday, still sharp as a tack and running the Double R kitchen like a general commanding troops. She died peacefully in her sleep one winter night, and they buried her on the hill overlooking the ranch, next to Jonas's parents. Lydia and Jonas had 4 children together, 3 boys and a girl, and raised Rosie as the eldest. They never hid her story from her, never pretended Thomas had been anything other than what he was. But they also made sure she knew she was loved unconditionally, that the sins of her father had no bearing on who she could become. The Double R prospered and grew, becoming one of the most successful ranches in the territory. But more than success, it became known as a place of refuge, a place where people who'd lost their way could find shelter and second chances. Over the years, Jonas and Lydia took in numerous people who needed help, remembering always how a storm and a broken wheel had brought them together. On their 20th anniversary, Jonas took Lydia back to the spot where he'd found her. The prairie looked exactly the same, endless grass and endless sky, beautiful in its stark honesty. But they'd changed. Jonas's hair was graying at the temples, and Lydia had laugh lines around her eyes from 2 decades of smiling. Do you ever regret it? Jonas asked. Staying here instead of going back east? All the things you gave up? Lydia thought about the question. She thought about her mother, who'd eventually come to visit and been surprised to find her daughter not just surviving, but thriving. She thought about the life she might have had in St. Louis, comfortable and conventional and ultimately empty. And she thought about everything she'd gained instead, a true partner, a family, a community, work that mattered, a life that was entirely her own. Not for a single day, she said honestly. That storm that left me here? It wasn't the end of my life, Jonas. It was the beginning. Everything I am, everything I've become, everything that matters. It all started right here, in this spot, on the worst and best night of my life. Jonas pulled her close, kissing her with the easy affection of 20 years together. I love you, Lydia Reeves. I love you too, Lydia said. Thank you for finding me. Thank you for bringing me home. They rode back to the ranch together, across the prairie that had once seemed so terrifying and now felt like the most natural place in the world. Smoke rose from the chimney of the house they'd filled with love and laughter. Children's voices carried on the wind. Their youngest 2 were playing in the yard with Daniel's oldest boy. Lydia looked at it all, the life they'd built from broken wheels and broken hearts and broken dreams, and felt nothing but gratitude. Thomas Hale had abandoned her in a storm, and in doing so had given her the greatest gift of all. He'd forced her to become someone who didn't need saving, who could stand on her own, who could choose love not from desperation, but from strength. And when that strong, independent woman had chosen Jonas Reeves, she'd chosen wisely and well. Sometimes, Lydia thought as they rode into the yard and their children came running to greet them, the road that shatters beneath you really is the one that leads you home. You just have to be brave enough to keep walking, even when you can't see where you're going. She'd been brave, and she'd found her way home. Not to a place, but to a person, to a family, to a life that was everything she'd never known she wanted, built from ruins and storms and second chances. The wagon wheel Jonas had saved from that first broken wagon still hung by the garden gate, weathered now but sturdy, a reminder of where they'd started. Every spring, Lydia planted flowers around it. Wild Montana blooms that could survive anything, beautiful because they were strong, thriving because they'd learned to bend without breaking. Just like her. Just like all of them. The lost and found who'd made the double R their home, who'd learned that family wasn't about blood or law, but about who showed up when you needed them most, and stayed even when things got hard. That evening, as the sun set over the prairie in shades of gold and rose, Lydia stood on the porch with Jonas beside her, their children settled in for the night, the ranch quiet and peaceful around them. She thought about the girl she'd been, abandoned in a storm with nothing but a baby and broken dreams. She thought about the woman she'd become, strong, capable, loved. "What are you thinking about?" Jonas asked, sliding his arm around her waist. "About storms," Lydia said, "and how sometimes they don't destroy you. Sometimes they just clear away everything that was never real to begin with, leaving room for something true to grow." Jonas smiled and pulled her closer. "That's a pretty thought." "It's a true one," Lydia corrected. "The truest thing I know." They stood together watching the stars come out one by one, filling the vast Montana sky with light. And Lydia thought about how darkness always gave way to dawn eventually, how storms always passed, how even the most broken things could be made whole again with patience and care and love. She'd been left behind in a storm. A cowboy had found her and brought her home. And that home, built on honesty and respect and choosing each other every single day, had become the foundation for a life more beautiful than anything she'd ever imagined possible. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was the life she'd needed. And that, in the end, made all the difference.